Hi, I'm Malika Bilal in for Fimi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, a young American journalist sat down with 4 al-Qaeda fighters inside Syria. We discuss how she did it and what she learned about them. Omar Badar, member of our digital team, is here looking out for your live feedback. Now, Omar, of course, as we both know, our community is opinionated. What are they saying about Syria?
They are indeed. We put out a question to ask what people actually think about the presence of al-Qaeda affiliated groups like the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in Syria, and we got a lot of interesting answers. If you take a look at my screen, Mirwais says, main thing is they are fighting in Syria against a dictator and they are fighting for Syrians. But we also have Abdul Malik Idris, who disagrees and says, if the West supports them, that means they support terrorism. That is exactly what Assad said, and I support him in saying this. For those of you at home, we want you to be part of this conversation, so please join in by tweeting at us using the hashtag AJStream.
Now today we're also joined by a few of the stream's community members. They're in our Google Plus Hangout and will help Omar and I pose questions and comments to our guests. You'll hear from them shortly. Now for those of you who are interested in joining future Hangouts, be sure to visit the stream on Google Plus and add us to your circles.
I'm Ala Shahabi. I'm a family member of Bahrain Watch and a researcher, and I'm on the stream.
What impact are foreign fighters and al-Qaeda having on the ongoing war in Syria? Earlier this year, a large al-Qaeda affiliated group named the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, also known as ISIL or ISIS, announced its official presence there. Some rebels initially welcomed the group as an ally, but now many resent it. They say ISIS, which has attracted many foreign fighters, has its own agenda. The group has taken control of various towns, establishing its own checkpoints and clashing with other rebel brigades. Analysts warn that al-Qaeda and affiliates like ISIS are jeopardizing the future of the country. So who is ISIS and what are they trying to achieve? One young American journalist attempted to find out. Anna Therese Day entered Syria and managed to sit down with 4 members of the group. Her article, Dining with al-Qaeda, published on the Daily Beast, discusses their involvement in the Syrian war and attempts to reveal who these men are beyond their weapons. She joins us on set. Anna, welcome to the stream.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And to shed more light on al-Qaeda and its affiliates, we're also joined by Aaron Zellin. He's a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Aaron, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
I want to start with you, Anna, because the question that many of us are asking is, how did you do it? How did you find yourself in a hotel speaking with 4 men who describe themselves as members of ISIS?
So this has been an ongoing process. I met my first contact over a year ago. We were able to publish something last year, but then we felt for about a year, for different reasons, not comfortable in publishing further work. So it wasn't until recently that we both, on both sides, felt it was appropriate to continue the work with the security and all the different considerations that go into reporting in Syria right now.
And how did you actually go about conducting the interview?
Sure. Well, the piece is part of a series that several more will be coming out, hopefully. And there are all sorts of security processes that had to be put in place. Involved lots of meetings throughout this past year. And the number one concern was ensuring their safety, not only from their greatest fear, which is U.S. drone strikes, but also different factions within their group that might not approve of them speaking with Western press.
So what is it actually like sitting down with them? You're in a hotel. Describe that scene for us.
Sure. Well, I've met with them on several occasions in many locations. So what's, I think, most interesting about it is when you actually meet them in person, they're quite disarming. They're the same age as me. In general, I guess I always thought that al-Qaeda fighters would be, I don't know, I guess some kind of like mythical, monster of some sort. That's the way they're portrayed in the United States. But these young men speak English. They were educated in institutions that I am familiar with. And in many ways, they can speak in Western references that I associate with. The departure is when we start talking about politics and their approach to solving some of the problems that we would maybe agree on.
So we have in our Google Hangout Rakan, who is a Syrian activist who actually has a question for you, Anna. Rakan, go ahead.
Well, first I'd like to know how many of these ISIS members she met during the course of all the meetings she had, and how she verified that they were actual ISIS members.
That's been an enormous challenge, not just in verifying these particular interviews, but also all of the reporting that we're all doing in Syria. The first interview that I did over a year ago, we actually did not report that this member was a member of Jabhat al-Nusra, because at that point I didn't feel like I had enough context to cross-check and verify his testimony that he was a member of Jabhat al-Nusra, but we were able to verify his Saudi citizenship. So that's how we began, and through the course of this past year it has been verifying with a lot of different sources on the ground, whether it's groups that will openly or not openly admit to working with these kind of groups, as well as other journalists and aid workers.
Rakan, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, did these guys have any kind of specific positions in ISIS? I mean, were they officers? Did they tell you they were snipers? Did they have any kind of title?
Sure. Yes. Actually, it's interesting because several of these men came in at different points. Even the men in this interview. So several of them have injuries at this point. A couple have been there for over, I guess, a year now. But then people came more recently, and all of them call themselves fighters, and they all will say repeatedly that they do not have permission from up higher in the chain of command to be speaking with me.
Well, you mentioned that one of them was from Saudi, and you verified that. Where these other foreign fighters, as you say, where were they from?
We have someone too from in the story, which I could speak about this specific story, although I hope 2 more will be coming out in the coming month. In this particular story, we had 2 men from Saudi Arabia who are brothers, and 1 from Pakistan, and then 1 from Kuwait.
Well, Aaron, I want to bring you in here. Now, just today, Al Jazeera reporters and others are reporting that 6 different groups in Syria, rebel groups, have united together to call on al-Qaeda linked groups like ISIS to leave, and to leave specifically a border region near Turkey. Is this the coming together that we haven't seen before of groups in Syria saying we don't want this? How much support is there for groups like this?
I think it's still too early, and there's a lot of fluidity in the situation. If you're specifically referring to the town of Azaz,
exactly.
I believe the statement actually was talking about how they should go back to their headquarters in Azaz instead of controlling the entire city. At this juncture, I think because there's still a huge fight against the Assad regime, many individuals within the opposition, especially what I like to term swing Islamists, where they sort of have their feet in with the SMC, as well as with some more extremist elements within the opposition, they realize that if there's a large-scale level of disunity, it'll then hurt the fight against the Assad regime, and therefore they don't necessarily want to alienate them too much. And the situation's continuously being fluid, especially as alliances are made, broken, and changed, especially in the past few weeks.
You know, we put a question out to our community asking them about why they think people join these extremist groups in Syria, and we got multiple responses. We have somebody here saying on Twitter, misguided priorities, indecisive ideologies, the need for leadership, negative life circumstances as a result of government action. We have a lot of other tweets along similar lines, lack of understanding, media glamorization, and confusion. I'm curious, through your direct conversations with people, what were the motivations that they gave you for why they joined these groups?
I think there needs to be a distinction between why Syrians have joined some of these groups and why the foreign fighters that I was interviewing with. The foreign fighters, all of them spoke about blowback, something that we hear now as a popular term in the United States, but something the media wasn't really covering before. All of them had sophisticated understandings of American involvement in their particular country, as well as the broader Muslim world. They talked about drone strikes. I learned more about the American involvement in Iraq than I even knew before. Coming out from interviews was a lot of fact-checking and realizing, wow, this is in WikiLeaks, you know. So I found that fascinating dealing with the foreign fighters. But with the Syrians, I think it's a combination of 2 things. I do think there's an increasing radicalization among normal Syrians due to desperation. I don't think it's unpredictable that people would turn to God in a time of complete abandonment by the international community. But then on the other hand, these groups are better armed, they're better trained, and I think young people want to be part of a winning team.
Well, Erin, she mentioned some radicalization, and I want to pick up on a piece and a point that was mentioned a little bit earlier about whether or not foreign fighters or Syrian fighters make up the bulk of groups, al-Qaeda linked groups like this. In a piece, an explainer piece that you wrote not too long ago, you explained that most of the support comes from Syrians themselves. But on my screen here, I picked up a piece from Syria Deeply, which is a blog that's covering the incidents and the crisis in Syria, and they mentioned some of the images that are being shared among Syrians. This one says, Wahed, 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 Bashar wa Daesh, Wahed, 111. Bashar al-Assad is one with Daesh, and that is the acronym that they give to al-Qaeda linked groups, saying that this is all the same. Majority of Syrians aren't for these groups. What are your thoughts on that?
I disagree with the premise. Many of the Syrians that are fighting with ISIS, the English acronym for the group, have previously been fighting with al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was the name of ISIS before they changed it this past April, against U.S. forces last decade, as well as Shia militias in parts of Baghdad and other parts of Iraq. So I don't agree with that. And also, if ISIS was run by the Assad regime, why would they be doing dawah events? Why would they be providing social services and social provisions? And why would they even be fighting the Assad regime itself? It just doesn't add up, and it seems like more wishful thinking and delusions than anything else.
All right, so we have with us in our Google Hangout Ayman Jawad al-Tamimi, who is a student in Wales of Iraqi background. Ayman, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, directed both to Aaron and the reporter. And to the reporter, did you encounter any native Syrians fighting under the banner of ISIS, or was it just were your experiences limited to foreign fighters?
My experiences were limited to foreign fighters because I actually don't have a relationship with the chain of command among ISIS. So I was lucky enough to meet these young men actually before they were members of ISIS, and that's why my contact is limited to these foreign fighters. While yes, there are Syrians, the majority of fighters are Syrians in ISIS.
That's what I thought too. Mm-hmm.
All right, Ayman, did you have a question for Aaron as well?
I mean, that was also going to be directed to Aaron. I mean, I'd just say that I was
Aaron,
just going to say my...
Sure, Aaron, what is your take on the ethnic makeup, basically, of these groups? How much of it are, what is the divide between Syrian and foreign fighters?
Yeah, I would say that the majority of fighters within the entire conflict are from Syria. There are, of course, many foreign fighters as well, and what's going on now is somewhat unprecedented in that it's probably almost on the level now of how many foreign fighters we saw in Afghanistan in the 1980s when they were fighting the Soviet Union. The majority of the foreigners are from the Arab world, specifically Saudi, Libya, Tunisia, as well as the states surrounding Syria. But the next largest sort of segment is from Western Europe, which is quite interesting in of itself.
And Anna, one of the things we're mentioning is these foreign fighters, but what we haven't talked about is how they actually get involved in this, how they enter Syria. Are they recruited? Do they come in their own volition? How does that happen?
That's been a fascinating part of the interviews. I not in the particular one that you're referencing in this, but in a previous interview that I published, I think a week before, one of my contacts speaks about how he had a Facebook. I was Facebook friends with a couple of these guys previously. They've since deactivated their Facebook, but at one point in this past year, I know that they were communicating with each other via Facebook, and they were bringing more people from the Gulf at the time, and it was through networks, through friends, through families, and that's the new age of new media, I guess.
Aaron, what about you?
There's a variety of networks that bring individuals into Syria. The majority of people go through Istanbul and then drive or take a train down to the southern border. And my understanding, based off of some conversations with people, is that the jihadists themselves actually don't bring these foreigners into Syria. It's actual professional smugglers. And there's a variety of networks. There's a main pipeline coming from Western Europe. There's one from the Balkans. There's one from the Caucasus. And then there's one from North Africa and the Gulf. So there's a variety of ways to get there depending on where one is from. And it should be noted that specifically the ones in North Africa are essentially reactivated networks that were used last decade in the fight in Iraq. And then in terms of the Balkans case, the old Bosnian networks from the 1990s have been regenerated for the first time in 15 years. So you've seen a lot more activity than we've seen in the past decade there.
And one of the things that was mentioned just briefly, I want to kind of touch on again, is what these groups are doing in Syria that could help garner some of this support. So we're going to roll a little bit of video of an activity, Family Fun Day, going on in Syria. And this is, of course, designed and aimed at generating support from the people that you talked to. Anna, is this an option because of the kind of social services that they provide?
Sure. They provide social services, and I think actually Aaron's article that you guys included on social media does a good job of explaining some of that. Around the holidays, I was with some of the fighters, and that was a big part of their campaign, is trying to make a holiday normal for children and families of civilians. So yeah, that's a major part of their campaign in building popular support on the ground.
Okay, so we have Amir Koji in our Hangout. Go ahead with your question.
Okay, this question is geared towards both of the panelists that we have today. First of all, thank you for spending your time here. My question is, there are statements made by ISIS that suggest that there's a declaration of war against the Free Syrian Army, and that document is available online. Now, can this be confirmed? And because after reports of fighting against the rebels in Azaz, a province in Aleppo, it's safe to say that the FSA can officially, is it safe to say that the FSA can officially consider ISIS its enemy, an enemy that's on the same level as Assad?
Aaron, would you like to take a stab at that?
Well, in terms of ISIS's official communications, they haven't put anything out like that as far as I know, but it's possible that there might have been a statement put out on the local level within Syria that they passed out to people. But, I don't think that ISIS is going to bring a future to Syria that anybody who went into the streets in 2011 would want either. Just look at previous examples of jihadi states such as the Taliban running Afghanistan, or smaller cases like al-Qaeda in Iraq running Western Iraq last decade, or even more recently with the case of AQAP in Yemen and southern Yemen, and then AQIM in northern Mali. There are major abuses that all these groups end up doing against civilians, and I think it would be just as bad as the brutality of the Assad regime.
Anna, he mentioned that they won't bring a future, but does this undermine the Syrian opposition and their struggle for what the end goal was at the beginning, to topple the government?
Sure. I gave an interview a year ago with a young fighter from Aleppo. He was part of the FSA, and he came to Istanbul, where they had a lot of the political leadership there, and he was part of the inside, and there's this big divide between the inside and the outside of the FSA command.
What do you mean by inside and outside?
So the fighters who are on the ground and staying inside Syria, and then the opposition that's trying to work with Western governments and the Gulf to get arms. Mm-hmm. And there is this disconnect of who has more legitimacy, if people are really part of the struggle, if they're at hotels in Istanbul. You hear this often. But he came up to actually warn the political groups that were trying to get money from the U.S., saying, listen, these people have come, and right now they're guests. They're these foreign fighters with far more radical views. We can't smoke cigarettes on the front lines, complaining about these things. But he said, you know what, they do share a religion. They do share a language in many points. The longer they're here, the more they'll be welcome. They are actually winning battles for us. So it was kind of a warning of what could happen. And from more recent interviews with some of these fighters, they're saying, we should have a Syrian passport for what we've done. I have this injury, I have that injury, I want to marry a Syrian bride. So I would say that this man a year ago was probably right.
Rakan, in our Google Hangout, you wanted to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it's important for the viewers to know that Syria is not under any kind of threat of being taken over by al-Qaeda. I mean, I'm in and out of Syria regularly. I've been here for 2 months now. Al-Qaeda, in comparison to the rest of the rebel groups, even the Islamist groups that are not Al-Qaeda affiliated, are just a drop in the ocean. I would say they're a nuisance at best.
Do you agree?
A nuisance at best. I kind of actually like to throw that to some of our other Hangout members, our Syrians who are in this conversation. Are they a nuisance at best, or are we looking at something that's on the same level of threat to the opposition as Bashar al-Assad? And I'll throw that to Muhammad.
I think that when we look at IS, Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, I think they're very little compared to Bashar al-Assad and his crimes. And just going back to that picture that you first showed, the one that said Wahid, 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 Bashar and Daesh, Wahid, they're just trying to show that the crimes that Bashar al-Assad is doing and the crimes that Daesh are doing are similar, not that they're working together. and also that Daesh, after Bashar is gone, is going to be our next target to get out because they don't stand for the morals of our revolution, and they stand completely against our revolution. We don't want them, and we don't want Islamic State in Syria. We want democracy for all Syrians, no matter what religion and what sect and whatever.
So we have a comment on our Facebook page from Eddie who says, Syrian citizens want freedom, dignity, and respect. They are not seeking to replace one unjust, oppressive regime with another, even if the latter calls itself a savior from God. So that's very similar to the sentiment we just heard. Aaron, do you have a sense of what the fate of these groups would be if Assad were toppled, whether these groups could then expand their influence or whether it would shrink?
I think that you'll see more of a backlash against these groups if the Assad regime does fall, because I think many are skeptical of their aims, especially ISIS. But even if you take ISIS out of this, you also still have a bunch of other groups looking to set up an Islamic State. It's just the different levels of radical types of interpretations of how they want to institute it. So even though ISIS might get out of the picture, you still have Jabhat al-Nusra, you still have Ahrar al-Sham, as well as other organizations.
We're running out of time for our main show, but Anna, I want to throw this to you because, of course, we've read about your first two pieces. What can we expect in the next two?
Some of the stories that I'm going to be telling are standalone interviews that I think will be very powerful for Western audiences to hear because, as I said, I've learned a lot about American involvement in the Middle East as a result of these interviews. So I think the theme of these is actually blowback.
Looking forward to that. That's all the time we have in the main show, unfortunately, but we'll pick up this discussion on Syria in the online post show at stream.aljazeera.com. But before we get to that, Omar has a few other stories that we're following.
Our first lead is out of Tanzania, where one photographer's pictures are petrifying. According to Neck Brand, petrified animals can be seen around Lake Natron in the north of the country. Scientists found that the lake's unusual chemical makeup and extremely high temperatures have essentially left many creatures, lured in by the lake's reflection, to die and calcify over time, like these ones. Next, the 13th annual World Toilet Summit is being hosted in Indonesia this week, and one city is not wasting the opportunity to promote its plans for more clean water and sanitation facilities. The city of Surakarta did this by hosting a toilet carnival. The summit participants from 19 countries have been touring various local sanitation projects. The goal of the summit is to address a global sanitation crisis affecting more than 2.5 billion people around the world. And finally, we have an update on a previous show we did on Iran and its political prisoners. Blogger and activist Mehdi Saharkiz was on our show to talk about his father, who was in jail more than 3 years. Today, Mehdi announced that his father has been freed, becoming the latest to join political prisoners released by the Iranian authorities.
Yeah, I heard about my dad's release today from my family. They went to his room and said that he's free to go. He no longer needs to stay in the hospital. This is 1,552 days after the arrest of Isa Sarkis that he's free to go. They did not ask him to come back, and he's not on furlough. So I am so excited. I would not believe something like this would happen so fast. And I'm overwhelmed with everyone's excitement, and I appreciate everyone's kind words towards me and my family.
Netizens are celebrating their release. Gisu tweets, "It is wonderful news and a hopeful sign for other journalists jailed in Iran today." What other stories are you following? Tweet them to us using the hashtag AGStream, and they could end up on a future show. Malika?
Omar, when we did that show in Iran, there was so much optimism and so much hope among the people on the show, and so maybe this is one little glimpse of why.
It looks like it's beginning to pay off. So
Good news, very good news. Thank you for that. Well, on the next show, imagine every single student failing their university entrance exam. That's exactly what happened to 25,000 high schoolers in Liberia. We'll look at who's to blame and what can be done to put the country's education system back on track. But stay with us. The post show on Syria is next at stream.aljazeera.com, and Omar and I will see you online. Welcome back to the Streams online post show. We've been talking about the impact foreign fighters and al-Qaeda are having on the war in Syria. The guest helping us discuss this today are Anna Therese Day. She's an independent journalist who recently interviewed 4 al-Qaeda fighters inside Syria. Aaron Zelen is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And of course, we have our Google Plus Hangout ready with their questions and their comments. Now, Anna, I want to start with you. In the main show, not too long ago, we played a little bit of video from a family fun day, we'll call it. But one thing that didn't get discussed after that video played is that there's accusations and allegations that children are being targeted for training and children are being targeted to be recruited. Did you see or hear of any evidence of that?
I've heard a little bit about this, but I haven't seen it myself, again, because I don't really see them in action. I meet with these fighters in an isolated situation, but this isn't unheard of at all. I know a lot of groups that are working for education inside Syria right now for all of the internally displaced Syrians are very concerned about this and looking for funding from places like the UN to kind of pick up the slack where these groups are really standing up.
Mm-hmm.
So we have Ayman Jawad Tamimi in our Google Hangout with another question. Ayman, go ahead.
Yes, direct to the reporter. I mean, it was regarding the way the ISIS fighters...
To interject, her name is Anna, but
Anna,
please go ahead.
Sorry, Anna, yes. The way the ISIS fighters, in particular the Muhajirin, present themselves, present their goal, their worldview. And I get the impression that when they talk to Westerners, they might talk about things like, say, the US invasion of Iraq and so on, and like a blowback for US policy. But in particular, with their own output, say, it comes from Al-Furqan Media, which is ISIS's media arm. In Syria, in particular, they're talking a lot about re-establishment of the caliphate, and they actually, they openly advertise a goal of establishing an Islamic State not only in Syria and Iraq but over the entire world eventually, and it's something I've noticed they've done a lot more, as particularly as ISIS has consolidated control over a number of Syrian towns like Azaz, Jarablus, and established presences elsewhere such as in Manbij and Al-Bab. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, beginning a year ago, people were talking about the liberation of Syria and then the liberation of Iraq, which doesn't quite make sense because, again, these are Sunni insurgents and Iraq is a Shia majority country, but they're not talking or thinking in terms of these nation-state borders. They'll say that's colonial imperialism and Western constructs, but you're certainly right. They talk about that a lot, and that first Syria, then Iraq, then beyond.
Then the world.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Amir Koji, you have a question as well?
More of a comment, actually.
Go for it.
If that's okay. It's more of a comment to the whole idea or the whole image of what ISIS is. ISIS is, what those videos you're seeing today is more of just like a propaganda, media propaganda. The same videos that Assad makes to show him, walking into the streets of Homs, praising the military. The ISIS is a very, very, very dangerous group in Syria, and they have an agenda. Their agenda is not to eliminate the Assad regime, but rather to fight to establish an Islamic State, just as Ayman stated. They're by no means there to follow the values of what our revolution would stand for, but they're mainly in there to eliminate the threat of Western imperialism or a Shia, quote-unquote, ruled government, and to establish an Islamic State. And it's quite frustrating to understand, to see that the ISIS are promoting this agenda in a way where they're helping the Syrian people.
Anna, would you like to comment on that?
I think that's a very fair statement. The aims when I speak with secular and pluralist organizers who were involved in nonviolent resistance from the beginning, even the Syrians who then escalated to armed resistance, there's a stark difference from their rhetoric as opposed to groups that are fine with escalating from armed resistance to terrorism.
Well, Aaron, I think that begs a question about how do we know where weapons are going and where they're coming from? Now, of course, for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about al-Qaeda. That's what the topic of today's show was on. But of course, we're also seeing tweets like this, all this talk about foreign fighters, but not one single word on Hezbollah. So, Aaron, that's out there. But I'd like you to comment on the weapons or the support that might be coming from the West, that might be coming from the Gulf, other places, and is it going to the places that it is geared to?
Yeah, I mean, depending on which group you're in, you have different sources of getting weapons. So, over time, we've seen the Saudis try and provide weapons to different factions, as well as the Qataris. But in terms of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, they have their own ways of getting weapons as well. And a lot of the weapons that actually many of these groups are using now are from victories they've gotten on the battlefield against the regime. So at air bases and other areas, there's huge caches of weapons. You see guys rolling around in tanks now. And so there's a huge market for them to get it within the conflict itself.
Muhannad in our Google Hangout would like to comment on this. Muhannad, go ahead.
All right, I just had a quick comment regarding the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham and the Syrian population instead of the opposition fighters, just basic Syrian civilians on the ground. I asked my personal family what they think of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham and the future of Syria being an Islamic State, and they completely don't want that at all. They think Syria is for Syrians, and they want Syria to be basically for everyone, and everyone has the freedom to do what they want, because that was the point of starting the revolution, which is for democracy and freedom for all.
All right.
I just wanted to kind of put that to the audience and clarify that even the Syrian population don't really want ISIS, and that they're just there for their own agenda, and majority of Syrians, or a lot of Syrians, don't support them.
I would add that I was very shocked in the past, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, when there were protests against ISIS in ISIS-controlled areas. I thought that was incredibly brave of Syrian civilians who couldn't be in more vulnerable situations, even the armed groups who are less equipped than the ISIS group. So I would maybe echo what he's saying, that I do think that the fact that they were brave enough to have popular public resistance to ISIS speaks volumes to maybe the original Syrian intent.
Now, Aaron, last question for you. How, after this conversation, how do we assess the strength, the depth of al-Qaeda in the world? I mean, this is a post-9/11 age, and we're hearing about them in more and more places. Is there a proliferation, and is that accurate?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question, because I think we shouldn't necessarily look at it from the global perspective. I think it's important to drill down to the local context in a lot of different places, since, in places like Somalia, Shabab is not as strong as they had been a few years ago. Same with in Yemen, as well as Mali. But in other places, like in Syria, they're obviously stronger than they had been a few years ago, since they weren't even there, really. And we've also seen a resurgence in Iraq after the United States left, and the recent prison break. So I think it's important to understand the local contexts, and also the fact that even though there has been a proliferation of groups over the past 2 years especially, each group still has different interests, even if they, broadly speaking, have the same worldview. So it's important to know what their direct aims are, whether it's more local/regional or more regional/global.
Right.
And sometimes that clashes.
Any last words from our community?
See, we have actually a question from Catherine, just to wrap the conversation up with. It's a question for you, Anna. She asks, who funds your trips? This is what I want to do, but how to get started? If you can just briefly tell her how, if you have any advice for people who would like to do something similar to what you've done.
Sure. I'm a big advocate for media reform right now, because there's freelancers are forced to take tremendous risks to do the work that we're doing. I was able to kind of get a step ahead by working when I was a student. I studied Arabic in Arabic-speaking countries and made contacts then, who then became protesters later in the revolutions that we saw the past 2 years. So I would say, well, if you're a student, being a student is a good way to get access to resources, because things don't pay at first, unfortunately. There are also grants available on ijnet.org, which is a good site for young journalists to take a look at. But in general, even someone who's been working now for 3 years full-time, it's not a well-paid gig.
And risks, of course, for the journalists and for the Syrians on the ground. That's all the time we have for today's show. On the next show, imagine every single student failing their university entrance exam. That's exactly what happened to 25,000 high schoolers in Liberia. We'll look at who's to blame and what can be done to put the country's education system back on track. And until then, we'll see you online. Thanks for watching.